Good evening, everybody. I'm Linnell
Hello.
Stevens, and I'm Village Preservation's Director of Development and Special Events. And I am joined tonight by my colleague, Hugh Evans, our Programming and Administrative Assistant, the lovely Hugh, will be your moderators and guides for this evening's incredibly wonderful talk. We are so excited to have our guest with us tonight and so excited that you've chosen to spend your evening with us. We really do appreciate it. Before we begin, I want to welcome you, introduce you to our organization. For those of you who don't know who we are, many of you do, and so you've heard this before, but I'm going to say it again. Village Preservation has been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark zoning protections and stop inappropriate development while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 more programs a year, just like this one, most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history, and depth of our communities, and the value, of course, of preservation. We're a non-profit, membership-based organization, so your involvement and your support mean a great deal to us. In fact, it means the world to us. You can learn more about us at our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member, making a donation, if you're able to, at villagepreservation.org/donate. And we're going to drop that in the chat right now so that you can access it. Alrighty then, just a tiny bit of Zoom protocol. Feel free to use the chat to say hello, tell us where you're joining from, raise any issues or thoughts. If you have questions for our speaker, please use the Q&A function, the question and answer function. It helps us to just keep track of all the questions, and you can do that at any point during the talk, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can after the talk. So for the great evening tonight, I am pleased to introduce our speaker, author and delightful person and historian, Michael Minichiello. Michael was born in Nyack, New York, and is an author, and he qualifies as a West Village original himself. He moved to Perry Street while he was still a teenager. He received a BFA from Hunter College, an MFA from Columbia University's School of the Arts, and pursued a career in graphic design. And since 1990, he's been living on Horatio Street, overlooking Jackson Square Park with his spouse. Jackson Square Park is one of my favorite places in the whole city. Michael's collection of interviews, West Village Originals, captures 90 interviews with Greenwich Village activists, business owners, journalists, writers, and artists of all stripes. As they share their stories, we get a clearer picture of both the myths and the reality that made this legendary neighborhood what it is today. So, Michael, thank you so very much for being here tonight. We really do appreciate it.
Oh, first of all, thank you, Hugh and Linnell and Village Preservation. I mean, how nice of you to host me. I think you're a great organization, and I'm delighted to be here. And actually, I love what you do.
Thank you so much. We're only honored to have you with us tonight.
Oh,
and I know our audience is very anxious to hear all the wonderful, fun, and interesting things that you have to talk to us about. I guess we'll just get started, jump in with some questions. And yeah, we've got, I don't have any questions in the chat yet, but Hugh and I are gonna just ask you a few of our own. So what first brought you all the way to the West Village from Nyack, New York?
Well, it wasn't that far a trip. It was only 20 miles. But
it's a far piece, though.
Yeah, it's quite different. And I actually knew the West Village very well, even when I moved in. And I was 19 when I moved in, but I already knew it very well. And I knew it was the one part of town I wanted to be in. And the reason I knew it is I spent a lot of time as a teenager in New York. My twin brother and I would come in and just spend a lot of nights here, actually. And in those days, interestingly enough, we could get into any bar we wanted to get into. And so we did a lot of socializing at night in New York, and also spending a lot of time during the day here. And I also learned more and more about this area, because when I was looking for an apartment, that was a very good way to discover the neighborhood.
Mhm.
And that's how I found the place on Perry Street.
Very cool. I see some of your neighbors are here as attendees. I'm very excited about that. Hi, Amy. Okay, that's cool. So that brought you to the West Village. And let's see, what year was that about?
That was October 26, 1974. I remember the day. It was a Saturday, and I recognize it every year.
That's so great. You know what? My anniversary is November 11th, and I'm not going to tell you the year.
You know, I kept that under wraps for a long time, and it's only recently where I finally said, oh, you know, I'm just going to go
Whatever.
for it.
Exactly. November 11th is my New York anniversary.
Nice.
I got a story to tell about that too, but I'm not going to tell it tonight because it's your night. Very good. So what was your neighborhood? What was Perry Street like in 1974?
Well, Perry Street and the West Village, it's funny. The first thing that came into my mind when I saw that question earlier was, well, there were a lot more bookstores then than there are now. And that sort of struck me. And there was a large bookstore on the corner of right next to Sheridan Square. You know where the Monster is now, that large club and bar? That used to be a bookstore.
Really?
And yeah. And I think they actually had the basement below it as well, which is now part of the club. But
Wow.
that was a bookstore. Of course, Oscar Wilde bookstore was on Christopher Street, and there were a
Yeah.
couple of others. And interestingly enough, this was even before Three Lives and Company started. They didn't open up until 1978. But the other thing is, there's so many more trees here now in the West Village and in New York in general. But this area got so green over the past 20, 30 years. I mean,
Yeah.
and those trees go all the way down to the water now.
Yeah.
And that's a really wonderful addition.
It's
And
funny you say that. I noticed that too. There are a lot more trees than there were 20, 30 years ago in the
yeah,
city.
and as a result, Linnell, a lot more birds, so many
Yeah.
more birds. And
Is
then
that
the
better
other
or
thing-
worse?
Oh, no, it's much better. Oh, they're wonderful.
More
There's-
birds than just pigeons. Let's put it
Oh,
that way.
yeah.
There are
Oh,
other
yeah.
birds than just pigeons.
Blue jays and cardinals we see right outside our windows in the park now. Oh yeah, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful addition to the city.
Yeah.
And what's also very different too are the local parks. When I moved in, Jackson Square Park and Abingdon Square Park, they were nothing but macadam. And you know, a couple of benches.
Yeah.
And now now they're just absolute jewels. They look
Yeah,
so
they're
beautiful.
incredible. They're so
Yeah.
beautiful.
And same
of
with
course-
Sheridan Square.
Yeah, and of course the addition, you know, a lot of folks were unhappy with the design at first of the AIDS Memorial Park, you know, the Triangle Park right there on 7th and Bank 11th, around in there. And you know, it's grown in to be so beautiful and such a gem. And of course the memorial is astonishingly, you know, profound and moving and beautiful, but the park itself is really quite lovely.
It is, Linnell, and you're right about the trees grew so fast in
Yeah,
that park.
they
They're
did.
huge now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
who
I think
doesn't
that
like
was
a
by
new park?
design. I think they knew they needed to do something really good and fast there because
Yeah,
there was so
because
much controversy. But yeah, they chose really great trees, I think.
yeah, and of course, down by the river, there was nothing when I first moved here. And now look at Hudson River Park is gorgeous. And then of
Yeah.
course we have Little Island now. So we keep getting more parks in the neighborhood, and it's just I mean, it's wonderful as a result. It's wonderful to
Yeah.
have the choice.
I'm hearing from P. Baker. I'm not sure what your first name is, but saw a red-tailed hawk in Carl Schurz Park recently, which we always
We
want to
actu-
hear about red-tailed hawk sightings.
No, we actually saw a hawk outside our window here, and he was perched on the terrace of 1 Jackson Square, which is the large building on the other side of the park. And the blue jays chased him away. So that was
That's really
quite a
good.
scene.
I love
This
it.
big hawk
It was
being
a
chased
it was
away.
definitely a village scene for the Blue
Yes.
Jays to chase away the hawk. Sounds a little bit like us as village preservation.
And then one other thing that I noticed too, when I moved to New York, you know, all the brownstones here were built as private houses back in
Right.
the 19th century. But by 1920, 1930, they started to take all of those and turn them into apartment houses. So you had like 4, 6, or 8 apartments in each of those buildings. And consequently, they had the tenants. Well, now most of those buildings have been turned back into single family homes. So you've lost, I think, a lot of population. Just
Yeah.
there isn't quite as many people on the street as there used to be.
Yeah. Well, certainly with the pandemic, we've
Mm,
lost a lot of residents, but they're coming back. They're coming back, just like you
yeah,
guys.
yeah.
So I guess my next question for you is tell us the story about making your way to Westview News. How did you get there? What was the process? What was the path?
Well, I started seeing the newspaper around, and I started to pick it up and read it, and I really enjoyed it. And in 2008, I saw an ad in it. George Capsis, who was the publisher, placed an ad and said he was looking for a graphic designer if anybody wanted to like work on the paper. So I called George, told him I was a graphic designer, and but in the conversation, he discovered that I had a master's in film. And so he immediately said, why don't you review films for the paper? So I said, okay. I had done that before. I'd reviewed films for the Film Journal when we were at Columbia. And I thought, well, that would be fun. And so I started to do that. But after a while, I mean, it was enjoyable, but I started to attend monthly meetings of the of Westview News when people would have editorial meetings. And little by little, it occurred to me that I thought one day, there are a lot of longtime people in the village, and there must be a lot of people who have interesting stories to say about the village, about their lives, about their jobs, and also, most importantly, what they feel about how this area changed over the years. Because suddenly in the 90s, and certainly by 2000 and afterwards, things started to change dramatically here. And I thought it was a good time to, start asking people about it.
Excellent. Yeah, the village has always been such a fertile ground for all sorts of interesting and wonderful things and people that I think you hit on something really great to kind of take the pulse of what's going on at the moment as it's occurring. Who are the change makers? Who are the artists? Who's doing it? What are they doing? What are they thinking? It's important.
Right. And, I did the interviews over a period of 12 years. I started in 2008 and I stopped in 2020. So it covers a good amount of time, but I also felt it was a good time to stop. And
Why was that? Why did you find it was a good time to stop?
Sometimes just a feeling. I felt I had done it, and the changes were continuing, and I thought, this is a good moment in time as far as the village goes, and also sometimes, there comes a point where the pieces suddenly become a whole, and you realize, yeah, that's it.
And that's when you decided you would compile it into all into a
Well,
book.
it's funny. I always had that in the back of my mind, Linnell, to compile it into a book, but I kept letting it slide and letting it slide.
You were too busy working, probably.
And then just out of the blue this summer, I ran into a fellow who's lived in the village all his life as well. His name is Ted. He owns a small publishing company. And he said to me, I used to love your column. Did you ever put it in a book? And I said, no, actually I didn't. He said, well, I'll publish it. And as they say, the rest is history. And
That's so great.
what was nice is we were able to move fairly quickly because everything was written. All the articles were pretty much done. And I designed the book as well. And so we were able to actually do it in maybe 4 or 5 months. We had December 1 was the pub date.
Very
And
cool.
yeah.
So when you were thinking about who you would write about what and who you would write about, how did you go about that? How did you find your interviewees and your subject matter?
Well, the first one I did was a friend of mine, so it was a fairly easy way to be introduced into it. But then I got a lot of recommendations from, again, these monthly meetings at Westview. We'd sit around the table and I would say, does anybody know someone who might be a good a subject for this column? And I would say, a majority of suggestions from people who actually wrote for the paper. And I also, had a little note at the end of the article saying, if you know someone who'd make a good West Village original, contact me. And I got a lot of interviews that way too. And interestingly enough, a number of people wrote and said, interview me. I'm a great subject. So I said, sure, okay. My only criteria really was that you had spent maybe 25 or more years in the area.
Oh, wow. So
No.
you really wanted dyed in the wool.
No, I wanted people who had seen the change. Yeah.
I see. So it's all about the trajectory. I know that you interviewed, or I'm pretty sure you interviewed our executive director, Andrew Berman, correct?
Andrew, absolutely. And
Yeah.
Andrew was my last interview.
No kidding.
No, and I thought, he would be a good subject because even though Andrew's never lived in the West Village, he certainly has protected it. And it was nice to get his point of view on that. So yeah, he's a nice addition to the book.
That's so great. Yeah, I mean, Andrew loves the village like nothing else. So
yeah,
all villages, the West Village, the East Village, NoHo, meatpacking. Yeah, we love those places.
Yeah, and he's such an advocate for it too.
He's an excellent advocate for our neighborhoods. He really, really is. Yeah, he does a bang up job. Hugh, you want to take over for? I'm hogging the stage here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really curious to know actually about your interview methods. Like, did you ask everyone the same questions? Was there a favorite question that you asked everyone?
Well, first of all, I did every interview over the telephone. And so I have never met most of the people I've interviewed. They remain voices over the wire. And although we've, stayed in touch, and the wonderful thing about the publication is I have been in touch with most of them again, and it's been great. But I did the interview over the telephone, and I did have a set of basic questions, Hugh, and that was sort of like the backstory. But then I would tailor questions to specific people, like whatever careers they had been in, whatever jobs they had done, or what their particular artwork was, or anything they had written recently or in the past. But I will say my favorite question was, tell me about your parents. And I will say many people were surprised by that. I don't think, yeah. I really think many of them, I could just tell, did not expect to be asked that. And I think a lot of them were actually moved by it. And it was my favorite question because I learned things about people's parents that were wonderful. And it was fascinating to me because it turns out that most people chose their careers based on their parents' careers or their parents' hobbies or how their parents had influenced them as kids.
So interesting. Wow.
Yeah, it was wonderful. It was really wonderful to hear that part of every interview. It was always the most enlightening in a way.
Did some of those people choose their career based on the opposite of their parents?
Well, no, it's funny. There were a couple who said, I couldn't get away from my family fast enough. But those were, there weren't that many of them. Like, Andrew, speaking of Andrew, who runs your organization, his father had a business that took him all around the city. And Andrew would go with him as a boy. And he said, my dad knew the city so well. And he would tell me about this place and this community and this building. And it stuck with him.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Mhm. Yeah. And
I once asked him a question about that too. And so not exactly, but I was like, what makes you so good at this? And he said, I'm not that good at it. He demurred, and he said, but when I was a kid, I used to go around the city with my dad, but I also was obsessed with arcane zoning laws. And I was like, what kid becomes obsessed with arcane zoning laws? But good on you, man. Thank goodness you are.
Yeah, but his family was some of the very first people whose apartment building was leveled when Robert Moses put in the Cross Bronx Expressway, and
Yeah.
he grew up hearing about that as well.
Right.
So that was a big influence on him as well.
Big influence on a lot of
Yeah.
people. Yeah, a lot of New Yorkers. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I spoke to a fellow who's came from a family of writers. He swore I didn't want to write. They were pretty depressed people. They never had any money, writers. They drank a lot. He said, I don't want to write. He ended up being a writer, and a very successful one, a journalist.
Oh, wow. Well, thank goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Keep going, Hugh.
Yeah. And we wanted to know, sort of, besides Andrew, what were your favorite stories? What was the most entertaining person you've ever interviewed?
I wasn't prepared for that. And they were they were all entertaining, Hugh, in their own way. Yeah. I think, if anything, some people spoke a lot easier than others. But that's about it.
What was it? So just in terms of interviewing people, I find it fascinating, how do you interview people? What are the questions that are the key? How do you open up a person? Your question about, the parents is fascinating. Were there any other insights that you came to about what would open up a person to actually free them?
It's funny, that was the first question was always, where were you born and where did you grow up? And then the second one was, tell me about your parents. And most of the times opened up, Linnell. That was sort of the entree.
That's
and then
really
I would
cool.
always ask them where you went to school. And then we would get into the specifics of, their career or their art.
Yeah. Yeah.
But most of them, I have to say, I think all of them were surprisingly, amenable and open. It was nice. It was the wonderful aspect about it. I didn't come across anybody who was like really resistant.
It's funny that you said that that most of the people that you interviewed it was done by telephone, because you strike me as a very people person. Seems to me you like people. I like people, so I gravitate toward people who like people. But I just it's funny that you only did it by telephone. Was there a reason for that?
Well, one was very practical, Linnell and Hugh, and that is, if you told someone we can do it by phone, it was a no-brainer. They were in. It was so easy to say, I'll call you Tuesday night at 7. It wasn't, oh, we got to arrange this. We have to arrange this. Where are we going to meet? So I think just that alone made it so much more amenable to anybody I was going to talk to.
Yeah, so great. So really great.
But I also, you did bring up a point. I've always been interested in people, and it never occurred to me before I started doing these that I had a knack for interviewing. But now when I think back on it, I think, yes, I've always, anytime I meet someone new, I will, and I don't know if they think it's rude or what, but I will immediately say, where are you from? And start asking them questions about themselves. And this was just sort of a natural extension of it. I like to listen when people talk about themselves.
Yeah.
And it was nice on the phone because there was no distraction, like if you were in person or in an actual space. It really just was, this conversation over the phone. And I could really concentrate on their words as a result.
Tell me something, and you may not want to say this, but that's okay too. It's not such a hardball, but what are your favorite things about the village, about our neighborhoods in general? Because our village is large. What do you love most? What do you not love most about?
I love the way it looks. I'm a very visual person, and even when I moved in 74, it was a little grungier.
Yeah.
But it's always been a very, very beautiful neighborhood. I've always just loved the way it looked. And I still do. I still do.
Did you dream of moving there when you were a little kid?
Not as a little kid, but as I said earlier, as a teenager, yes. I sort of knew this was the neighborhood I wanted to be in. And I moved to Perry Street. Then I moved to Grove Street for about 10 years. And that was an interesting part of the village. I didn't really know about the village south of Christopher, but you have Grove and Commerce, those beautiful little streets back there. And that's a wonderful little
place.
enclave. And it ends with St. Luke's Place.
Yeah.
And then I moved here to Horatio, which is the very northern end of the village. So I lived around, and again, it's a beautiful neighborhood. It's a beautiful neighborhood.
Yeah.
Visually.
We're lucky to take care of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
We really are.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, historically too, I just find that while it's beautiful, you walk on these streets and I am just in awe always of those who walked here before me, always in awe, always looking for, what's behind those walls, those windows, who lived there, what were their lives like, what they write there, what they think there.
Well, it's funny you say that too, because I interviewed a fellow, his name is Edward Field, he's a poet, and he said some really nice things. Do you mind if I read from it?
Please, we're very excited about that.
And this is Edward. For Field, being in the West Village for many decades means that the past is constantly present. When I walk, and this is him speaking, when I walk through the village, I really walk down memory lane, he says. I know what the old shops were before Mark Jacobs moved in. I hear the sounds of the old village. There used to be typewriters clacking from windows as writers wrote their novels. There were violinists practicing, sopranos trilling away, and guys walking around with paint-colored Levi's. It's all here in my memory and consequently very real. So that's a lovely way to think about it. Did we lose Linnell?
Oh, just for a second. But yeah, I do think that is.
I just need to sneeze.
No worries. And we wondered, because you've spoken a little bit about your perceptions of how the neighborhood's changed over time. Do you have any interviews that sort of capture that shift between the West Village when you moved and the West Village that currently exists?
Oh, sure. I mean, there used to be a pony farm on 10th Street and Washington.
Really?
And they rented. This is even before they put up West Village housing. Those brown brick buildings way at the on the highway there. There used to be a pony farm there, and he'd rent the ponies out for parties. And then there was another. Susan Brownmiller, who was the writer and lives on Jane Street. She said, if I can read from hers, she says, when I first moved here to Jane Street, nobody wanted to live this far west. I remember when Hudson Street was filled with furniture stripping places. I remember when the meatpacking district was absolutely thriving, but as an industrial area. I remember the Frankfurter factory on the corner of Jane and Greenwich Streets, and the ice cream factory on Jane Street. And there was the smell of ink from the Superior Ink factory down by the river. So it's like a different world, really.
Yeah.
And this isn't 100 years ago. We're talking, this was even before I moved in, but she moved in like in 1966. She moved into in Jane Street. So it sounds, like I said, it sounds like a different world. And another woman said to me once, she'd been here so long, she says, when I walk down the streets, I feel like I'm seeing things in 3D, because not only do I
Wow.
see the building that was there before, but the one before it.
Wow.
That's
Fascinating.
really interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's
She
like
lived, she
I
lived
was
on Bank Street since the 40s. And I interviewed her, 60 years
interesting.
later.
I was
Yeah.
I just wrote a blog for Village Preservation about Lillian Hellman, and I always, she wrote a book called Pentimento, and I always think about, what the erasure of the painting, and what's behind it, the Pentimento, and our buildings are that way too. You can sort of see the layer of what was there.
I mean, we're very lucky here. Greenwich Village was the first historical district in New York City, or the first district to be named as a historical district, and that was 1969. And so it's been protected for 50 years now.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I think
is that correct, Lynell?
I actually think that. Well, I think that actually in Manhattan, you're right,
really?
absolutely right. But I think that the Brooklyn Historic District, that the there's going to be somebody on this program who's going to know better than I. But there was a historic district in Brooklyn that was the first, and somebody's in the chat already telling me that.
Oh, okay.
I'm pretty
Brooklyn
sure.
Heights. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's Brooklyn Heights is the first, I think. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, well, I'm all right. Thanks for
But you're
that.
right about
I was-
Manhattan. You're right about
Okay.
Manhattan.
All right.
Yeah.
So I think being, on that list for 50 years has made a huge difference here. Although I have to say, 1 Jackson Square, which is that modern building across the street from us, it's
Yeah,
sort
the
of that
wavy one,
undulating
yeah.
glass building. It's actually, it's a beautiful building. They did a beautiful job building it, and I think, in a way, it's nice to have things like that too.
We're not against, progress at
Right.
all at Village Preservation.
Right.
It's just about what's appropriate for the neighborhood and the surroundings of the building that's proposed. There are a number of contemporary buildings that have gone up since the district was designated that are successful. They're very successful, and are very important new buildings. So,
well,
yeah.
like we were talking earlier, before everybody joined us, about Rick Meyerowitz, and he said, "While I love the historic and low-rise character of this neighborhood, I'm somewhat tired of derivative red brick buildings being built to look like something old. I believe you can retain the character of this neighborhood and still have some interesting and forward-looking architecture." So that's a nice point of view as well. Because
it's true.
Curiously, there are a number of people in the book who don't mind change. And some woman, Nancy Weber was her name, interestingly enough, said that's the point of the village is change. It's always changing.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
she didn't mind that things were disappearing and new things were coming in. So that was interesting.
Yeah, I hear that, and I agree too. It's just that when you want to, like, let's say this isn't true, but let's just say you wanted to take down the place where James Baldwin lived and worked and wrote, I would be opposed to that. Sorry.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I think Nancy was talking more about businesses and stuff. She mentioned a bakery. I think she mentioned Sutter's. She said, it's too bad that, that concerned that Sutter's isn't here anymore. And Sutter's used to be a huge bakery on the corner of Greenwich Avenue and 10th Street.
Okay.
And very, very popular. Sunday mornings, it was absolutely packed.
Okay. It's interesting. When I was in high school, this is going to maybe date me, I'm not sure, but when I was in high school, I came to New York several times to see theater. And, the place that everybody wanted to come, of course, was Greenwich Village. We would, we stayed in one of those old hotels in the theater district. And then we'd spend our days in Greenwich Village because that's where you wanted to be.
Yeah.
And there was this bakery that I remember still to this day, and maybe somebody in our audience will remember it. It was called Mrs. Grimbles.
Really?
And I remember I couldn't wait to go to Mrs. Grimbles, that was the place to go. It doesn't exist any longer, but maybe somebody remembers Mrs. Grimbles.
There was a great bakery called Jean V on 6th Avenue and 11th Street, between 11 and 12.
6th Avenue between 11th and 12. Yeah, okay.
They made
All right.
incredible stuff, including extraordinary chocolate chip cookies.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. There's some pretty decent chocolate chip cookies still in the village, I can say.
They were good too.
Yeah, one of my favorite places, and they were one of our business of the month. Actually, they got a village award one year. Is Patisserie Claude, which is on. Oh my gosh, the best croissants. They are like mouth-wateringly good. They are really yummy. We love that place. On Washington or 4th, I can't remember. It's where those streets kind of divide there. I can't ever remember if it's Washington or 4th. 4th, yes, Denise. Thank you, Denise. Yes, 4th Street. That's right. We love it.
Yeah, and someone just wrote, Did you say Lanciani?
I said Claude.
Yeah,
Lanciani is another one.
I was going to say there was another one there, and that was Lanciani. Patisserie Lanciani. Yeah, that was
West
a great
Village,
one too.
though, right?
Yeah, thank you, Jane.
We're gonna have to invite you back for another talk about just bakeries in the village. But I also wanted
bakeries in the village.
I wanted to ask, because we're so struck after reading this book with my colleagues, we're so struck by the variety of voices that are collected in your interviews. And I'm really wondering, how did you compile all of them into a single book?
Well, it's interesting because I always thought the book would just be chronological, like the interviews had been, and then, well, one day my spouse and I sort of took all of the articles. He laid them all out on the rug in our living room, and we started to put them into categories. And the wonderful thing about that was suddenly the breadth of the book became apparent. It was like, wow, this is, we sort of run the gamut here. We have business people, we have community activists, artists of all media, writers, we have poets, dancers, of course, lots of theater people and photographers. And it just became very exciting to me at that point, was to see all those categories. And that's where we finally went here. And
very cool.
And I think it makes it a much more interesting book as a way.
Yeah.
Not to be so slavishly, not to be chronological, but just do them by category like that.
I have a question that just came into the chat. Everybody, if you want to ask questions, be sure to do it in Q&A, but I love this one. The village is, and this comes from Edward Adams. The village is associated, obviously, with outsiders and eccentric people. Did you ever interview anyone who was the opposite, who was really part of the establishment?
That's interesting. I interviewed a number of business people, but even business people in the village are a little eccentric. So, I mean, not so much establishment. I mean, I did interview Frederick Block. He's a Superior Court judge here in New York, and but he's a fascinating character. And I interviewed James Stewart Polshek, who is a very accomplished architecture. He designed, among other things, the Natural Museum, the Museum of Natural History, the Science Hall there, and also the Jefferson Library. I mean, the Clinton Library out in Arkansas.
James Polshek is one of our board of advisors.
Oh, really?
He is an amazing, he is,
And
great
so
architect.
I guess you could say they were establishment, but I think by the very fact that they end up in the village is sort of the clue that they're not, though, really. They're interesting guys. I really enjoyed talking to both of them.
Very cool. Very great. So, as Hugh said, we're going to open up questions to the audience pretty soon. So everyone, please feel free to place your questions into the Q&A function so that we can, it's in the toolbar, so that we can take your questions for Michael. Michael, in the meantime, I just wonder, is there any other, is there another reading you'd like to do? Anything
Yeah,
in particular that you'd like to read
I've
for
actually
us?
got a couple marked if you don't mind. And,
Please do. I'm going to stop my video so I can sneeze again.
Oh, okay.
So go right ahead.
But
Yeah.
you're still with us, right, Hugh?
Yes, I'm still with you. We'd love to
Great.
hear some readings. Yeah.
So this sort of harks back to the earlier when we were talking about, do people accept the change or reject the change, or they're disappointed about it? This is from David Rothenberg. And David's lived in the city since 1959 and in the West Village since 64. And he started the Fortune Society back in the late 60s. And he's still running it. And he also has a radio show on WBI that he still does. But I asked David, I said, do you have any final thoughts on being a resident of the West Village? And he says, just about how lucky I am to be here for all these years, he readily admits. When I first got here, all you heard was everything was great 20 or 30 years ago. I'm very nostalgic myself about the days when I came here. I look back and I miss things. You soon realize, though, that what you're really missing is your youth, when it was all new and fresh. But I'm not one of those people who think that everything great happened in the past. I still feel this neighborhood is exciting. That's because people who march to a different drummer come to the village. They always will.
Wow.
And then here's another one from Penny Jones. Penny has lived since 1970. She's lived in Westbeth. Penny owns a puppet, Penny Jones and Company Puppets. And this is her reminiscence of the village back then. And I love this one. It's so charming. When I first moved here, what I loved about the village was how pretty and charming the streets and buildings were, she reminisces. You would pass these wonderful little curiosity shops where people were doing their own thing. I was extremely happy too, because I would wear whatever I wanted to wear and just blend in. I wore these kind of Greek sandals that were made by a local shoemaker, and nobody looked twice. Everybody else was wearing them too. The village was like a family. It was my kind of place, all blissful and peaceful. It was a very lovely time, as if summer would never end. So those comments are very moving.
Yeah.
Because she is remembering her youth in a way, but it's also, it's a lovely reminiscence. There's no, anger in it or sadness or whatever.
I think
There's a certain melancholy.
Yeah. I do think that we would all do well to remember, especially in these big cities. I guess it's everywhere, but that we are, we have to take care of our villages and take care of the villages beyond and beyond and beyond, and just take care of one another, right?
Yeah.
Make sure that we're all, that we're neighborly.
Yeah, and from what I hear about the village, this is a place where people come and find chosen families. And it's an incredible place of community gathering.
You're right. You're right. And it proves that family is not just immediate family. It's who you're surrounded by. And that brings me to a guy named Richard Errett Weigel, who's lived on Grove Street for close to 50 years now, 45. And he said, he talks about the village. And he said, from the moment I moved onto Grove Street, it was clear that no one cared about your race, your religion, your sexuality, your college, or what your parents did. It was, tell me about yourself right now. That's the way the village has always been for me and always will be. It's about tolerance. And that's a really nice observation too, I think.
Yeah, it's great. It's wonderful.
And
Keep going. I want to hear some more. It's nice to hear you read it, Michael.
Say that again?
It's very nice to hear you read these sentiments. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I'll go back to Edward Field, the fellow who talked about walking down the street and hearing, typewriters clacking, coming out of the windows, those things.
I love that.
Mhm.
I'll continue with his. However, Field acknowledges that it's a world that has changed utterly in every way except externally. The buildings are still the same ones that have always been here, he says, but everything else has changed due to economics. Fortunately, when the village went upscale, Westbeth was here for us artists to move into. It was a way to keep us here. We're the survivors, the last of the artists in the village.
Hmm.
When asked if he has any hopes for the future of the West Village, Field candidly admits, well, I won't be here that much longer. Then he thinks for a moment. But if a place like Westbeth can survive, he continues, it will be good for keeping alive the memory of what the village was, a safety valve for all of America where people fled to so they could create art and express their sexuality. In every sense, it was a whole radical world when the rest of the country was devoted to business, respectability, and morality. The village was the place of ideas.
I love that.
Interestingly enough, though, Edward is still alive and he's 98.
Go
And this
Edward.
interview was,
Oh,
Does he still live in
was 10
Westbeth?
years ago.
Do you know if he
Yes.
still lives at West? Oh my God, that's
Mhm.
amazing.
Yeah.
That's
I
so
actually
cool.
interviewed probably a dozen people who live in Westbeth.
Mhm.
It's a fascinating collection of people there, and it's a fascinating story
It's a
itself.
fascinating
it was
story.
it was the first time they ever took an industrial building and adapted it for reuse. In this
Adaptive
case,
reuse is one of our
yeah.
favorite things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The greenest building is a building that's still standing.
And what's fascinating too is I just heard from an old friend of mine and my spouse's, Joni is her name. She sent me a card because I had sent her a copy of the book. And she said, my uncle worked at Bell Labs and he retired in 1970.
So for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure there's probably nobody on this on this webinar who doesn't know, but Westbeth, the building of Westbeth was originally Bell Labs, and so yeah, it was turned into a home for a home, artist home. Yeah, there's different units, and there's a center courtyard. It has a theater. It has all kinds of wonderful things inside it. So yeah.
Yeah. So any you want to hear some more reading or we're going to take questions?
Yeah, I think it's a good time to pivot to questions. We have a healthy amount in the chat. Yeah. So first from Nick Houghton, he wants to know if there's a person that you've interviewed that has come the farthest to settle in the area.
Say that again, Hugh, to
Yeah.
settle in the area?
Who have you interviewed that's come from the furthest distance, from the furthest away?
Oh, interesting. Off the top of my head, that's difficult. I think one guy was born in Los Angeles. Oh, I think it would be Via Vetra is her name. She's a dancer. Via must be, she was born in 1922 in Riga, Latvia. Wow. So yes, I think it would be her.
Yeah.
She sort of traveled the world. She lived in Australia for a while, and then she moved to Westbeth pretty much again when it opened around 1971. So I think Via would qualify there, all the way from Latvia.
Yeah.
There's a really, cool. That's really interesting. Go ahead, Hugh.
Yeah, I wanted to ask what her story was. That's fascinating. How did she get to the village?
Well, she's a dancer, and she would go on tour, and like I said, she settled in Australia for a while, and then she came to America on a tour, and she started teaching here in the city, and that's when she moved to. She had her own dance company, and then she moved to Westbeth, and has been there ever since.
Cool.
Yeah, and then from an anonymous attendee, we want to know if any of your interviewees described getting lost within the village streets, especially the way that the grid switches and curves around.
No, I have to say no. No, they all, by the time I got to them, they knew the area very well.
Yeah. I would imagine 25 years
to the
you get to
point where
know.
they could, yeah, to the point where you could say it's on the corner of West 4th and West 10th, and it would make sense to them.
I want to go back for a second and just say that for anybody who wants to know about Westbeth and its evolution, there's a book by one of our supporters and diehard supporters, whose name is Roberta Gratz, who also was a friend of Jane Jacobs. And the book is called "It's a Hell of a Town," Joan K. Davidson, the J.M. Kaplan Fund, and the Fight for a Better New York. So that's also an interesting book if you're interested in reading about Westbeth and how it came about and what it's about and all that.
Nice.
Yeah. Go ahead. Let's do some more questions here.
Yeah, returning to the audience questions. So Michael, if you did any more interviews, if you were to start again, who would be the first person you'd start with?
That's a good question. Again, Hugh or whoever asked the question, I never really have, well, I do have particular people in mind sometimes, and I will pursue them. But well, actually, yeah, it would be probably George Kapsis, who publishes Westview News, and he's the Westview News is, as they say, the true voice of the West Village. George started this paper in his townhouse, and it's been going strong now for 20 years. It's a wonderful paper. It's a wonderful asset for the community. There's a lot of great writing in it, and I will be eternally grateful to him for giving me the opportunity to write this series. And he was always most delighted to print my columns. And the only reason I didn't interview George was we felt it, as the owner of the paper, it would have looked a little dicey, but he might be the next guy.
Tell us this is from Brooke Schooley. Hi, Brooke. What was the most surprising response from an interviewee? What made you most surprised?
Ooh.
If you can remember, or if there was just one, there may have been many.
No, gee, I hate to draw a blank on that, but I'd have to think about that.
All right.
If he wants to send me an email,
I'll send. If you don't mind, I'll send Brooke your email address.
Sure. Yeah. Yes. Well, not the most surprising thing, but a very interesting thing was one fellow, when he was a boy, his mother abandoned him. They had moved to a small town in West Virginia. His father gotten a job in a small town in West Virginia, and his mother was extremely unhappy there, and she left with a salesman from St. Louis. And so that wasn't so much surprising, but it was a very interesting anecdote.
Sounds like a Horton Foot play.
Well, yes, but he said it sounded like an Ida Lupino film.
It could be that too. Yeah.
Yeah, that dramatic. And he never saw her again.
Wow.
Either.
Okay, that's pretty surprising, Brooke, if that doesn't answer your question.
Yeah, and another fellow too. He left the South in the 1920s. His mother discovered his father was having an affair with a woman, so she took the whole family up north, minus the father, and he never saw his father again. And he was only about 6 years old when this happened. So that was an interesting story as well. Not so much surprising. I'll have to think about the surprising one. I sort of like boned up about people before I talked to them, so I sort of knew a little about them, but I don't think I ever heard any real bombshells.
Okay, all right.
It wasn't that kind of an interview.
Okay. That's interesting. Have you included your own interview in this book? That's from
of myself?
Yeah.
No, but I did write an introduction, and
Okay.
I talk about the origin of the articles and the column itself, and I do talk about coming to New York and how it's changed for me as well, and what I remember myself when I first moved to New York, the places I used to go to, and the
Yeah.
places I remember.
Yeah.
There was a lot happening in the village back then. I don't. I have to say I don't go out that much anymore. And let's face it, the past 2 years, most of us haven't gone out a lot. But
Yeah.
when I was young, there were a lot of different places in the village to go to,
Yeah.
which was, and they ran the gamut, which was nice.
Did you ever interview anyone with kids from Debbie? Debbie Carter says, I moved downtown from the Upper West Side to get away from kids with parents who take up the sidewalks. Oh, I know that so well. Yeah, you always have to get away.
Well,
Anyway, did you
Well,
interview
here's something
parents?
from Keen Berger, and Keen was born in Minnesota while her father was governor, and she taught human development for many years. And she says, when Berger and her husband started having children, they were living on Bedford Street, and she assumed they would have to move to the suburbs. But Martin said, no, we can do it here, she recalls. That surprised me, but it turned out to be a great place to raise children, and they had a wonderful upbringing. When our daughter Rachel returned from her first semester at college in Maine, she said, Mom, you protected me too much. I never knew there was so much homophobia or sexism in the world. Berger laughs. That's symbolic of growing up in the village. You're much more likely to understand people of all different backgrounds and appreciate them. So she had Keen had, I think she had 3 or 4 children. And so did another writer called Catherine Revlin. She had 3 daughters, and they all moved into a small flat here in the village with a dog and a couple of cats. And Catherine was from North Dakota.
Wow.
And dreamed as a girl. She was in the library as a girl and found a book about a woman who lived in Greenwich Village and said, this is what I want to do. And she made it happen.
That's so cool. That's
Yeah.
really great.
Yeah.
Did you ever interview Matthew Broderick? I'm getting to the end of our questions here, so I just want to.
No.
Not Matthew or Sarah Jessica. No.
Although Sarah's a great advocate of the paper, but no.
She is. In fact, they both are big advocates of civic life, right, and you know, all the things that the village espouses. Yeah. Are there stories about villagers and their pets in your book?
No, but there is one woman. Her name is Stephanie Phelan, and she does do dog portraits.
Oh,
small miniature portraits of dogs, and they're beautiful. She does them in enamel, and she will find like a piece of wood on the street, and will do that. So she paints pictures of pets, but no specific stories about pets.
If there are any pet lovers here, we should probably find her out and send you her send you her information, because that sounds really cool.
Well, Stephanie was the graphic artist for Westview for many years.
Really? Oh, cool.
And she was also an auxiliary police officer, and still is. So she's very devoted to the community. I think that's the theme that runs through the book, Linnell and Hugh, is this devotion to community. And it's like Whitney North Seymour was a fellow who spent many years in the village. He was so devoted to it, but he said, the village gives us so much and we need to give back. And he was a great advocate for community service. And I think that's how so many of the people, all the people in the book feel about the village. And it also, I think, they might be disappointed in changes. The changes might not be that dramatic to them. But I do have to say that every single person, I think I can say that they would all agree that the West Village gave them a quality of life they felt sure they never would have found anywhere else.
A quote that I'm going to probably get wrong, but maybe you're right. I'm not sure. It occurs to me right now, and that is that those to whom much is given, much is expected.
Yes, yes. Now, the real challenge with the West Village now is there is extraordinary amount of money here. And I think the challenge will be, are these people going to have the kind of allegiance that the earlier generations have had towards it?
It's a really good question. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's a question. And yet, what's funny is I think of a young woman in my building. She moved here a few years ago. I don't even know if she's 30, and yet she's on our co-op board, but she's also on the board of the Jackson Square Alliance. And she's just one of those people who just gets it, or that's what moves her, is community service. And so, if I want to get down on it, I think about her and say, no, but there are people here, and hopefully there are more of them. I just think, go ahead.
I feel like it's up to those of us who are involved in community service and community activism, and the people who love their city, to actually inculcate younger ones.
Right.
It's up to us to inculcate them. This is everything. Your community, your village, your place. Help your neighbors and become involved. It's all about that, I think, anyway.
Right.
Yeah. Did you interview politicians in this book, or in your interviews?
Well, yeah, Arthur Schwartz, who was
Arthur Schwartz, yeah. On 11th Street, 11th.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
he's a local politician.
A fellow named David Gruber. I guess a lot of the sort of the politically active people come under community activism as well. Yeah. And the fellow I was talking about, Whitney North Seymour.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm flipping through the book now. I want to make sure I get it right. But Whitney was he was an attorney, and he served in the New York State Senate, and he was also attorney for the Southern District of New York. So, and he ran for office for a couple of different offices, and this is him. The village was a wonderful hotbed of political reform in the 50s and 60s. At that time, I was assistant DA and was urged by others to get involved in the political process on the proposition that everyone complains about politics, but no one does anything about it. Amazingly enough, all three of his appointed positions came after he ran for public office and was defeated. That was because I had shown my willingness to fight, he remembers. As a result, I came to people's attention.
Wow, he sums up a lot there that I agree with him. And I feel like, yeah.
He was a wonderful fellow, and he lived to be, I think, 95, 96.
Where did he live?
Say that again?
Where did he live?
He lived on West 11th Street, and he and his wife Katrina moved there in 1951.
Cool.
Yeah, and they actually, back then, the village didn't have any sidewalk cafes. I don't know if people just hadn't thought about it, but they had been to Europe and they had seen all these outdoor cafes, and they said to each other, why don't we have anything like that in the village? So what he and Katrina did, he said, as we rode up and down the streets in the village, we jotted down the names of businesses we thought would be interested in sidewalk cafes. We wrote to them. We told them they could apply. And in those days, it was only $25 for a license. And he said, next spring, there were dozens of sidewalk cafes around the village.
Amazing. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It was the burgeoning of the new world in our, the old world, new world in our villages. I think that this is a great place to kind of wrap it up, you guys, because we've gone the gamut of, politics and all the wonderful parts about our neighborhood and the things that we hope for and strive for in our neighborhood and the people who help make it happen. Michael, last words for you?
Well, it's actually on a personal level, this is very satisfying. I'm so happy I did put it in a book. And I want to thank Ted again, the publisher. I'm not sure I would have done it on my own, and it was nice to have someone behind me to show me the ropes. And I think this is lovely. And if I can, toot my own horn, I want to read a note I got from an old friend of ours called Linda. And Linda, if you're still on, I hope you don't mind me reading this, but it's a couple of ideas that I hadn't thought about the book or about myself personally. But she wrote, "Dear Michael, your book is wonderful. I like it so much. It's a great combination of journalism, history, and fascinating people. You've done an important job as a preservationist." And I never thought of it that way, but I do think, yeah, this is, these stories now are forever in print and we have preserved them. And I think that's really special. And thank you, Linda, for your card.
Thank you, Linda,
was
because
very
she
sweet.
summed it up. It's really great. It really is about preserving the stories and keeping all of these ideas alive and passing them on.
Mm-hmm. And also, thanks again to you, Linnell, and you, Hugh. You've been wonderful leading me through this and, encouraging me. And again, I'm such a fan of village preservation, and I wish you all the best. I really
Thank you
do.
so much. Michael, it's been an extreme pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Same for me.
We're so happy to have had this time with you and with all of you in our audience. We're really, really grateful to you for spending the evening with us and with Michael, and it's just been a joy.
Thanks to everyone who showed up, and if any of my brothers and sisters are out there, thank you as well.
I see them.
I have 8 brothers and sisters, so I hope some of them are on.
All the Minikiellos are there. I see all their names.
Good night.
All right. Good night, Michael. Good night, Hugh. Good night, everybody out there. We really appreciate you. Take care and come back.
Good night.